Hello, this is Stephanie Milligan, and this is my research project, Quakers of the Civil War Clash of Conscience. So, a bit of an introduction to methodology. During the Civil War period, members of the Quaker religion faced great inner turmoil and challenges within their own religious group and society due to their religious beliefs and depth of involvement during the war. This research project aims to highlight those stories of different Quaker historical figures consisting of soldiers, aides, and women to discuss the multifaceted problems that Friends face when thrown into the efforts of war and delve into these conflicts. Most of this research was conducted through the use of direct online Quaker resources, letters, diaries, genealogical pages, and scholarly articles. So just a little bit of Quaker history here. They originated from England, and by the 17th century, due to political unrest and the English Civil War, they felt disconnected from the Church of England, and they sought a way to simplify Christianity. The founder, George Fox, preached a return to this simpler time and aimed to move away from this complicated ways of life and the violence that they were seeing during this time, including the death of King Charles II. They faced great scrutiny from colonial America, and it was not until William Penn founded Pennsylvania in 1681 and proclaimed religious liberty. So a few key Quaker beliefs are the inner light, this direct connection to God and portal to truth and righteousness, strong emphasis on spiritual equality within all people under God despite race, gender, background, or other external factors. These two here are interconnected with each other. They believe that all people have this inner light or are able to seek out this inner light. So these two go with each other most of the time. Value direct communication with God and do not believe in rituals, but rather listening to their inner conscience. They do not have, say, a church. It's more so a meeting house, which is why they're called the Society of Friends, or Meeting of Friends, or Meeting of Society. They will go to this meeting house and they will sit in silence until someone feels within them that they need to speak, that God has come to them to communicate to the rest of the group that they feel is important. And there is a piece in this project where we do talk about that a little bit. So community is very important. Of course, all of these go together with each other as well, but this direct communication with God and community, these are also interconnected with each other. Pacifism is key to connection with God and inner divinity. Violence and war, greatly frowned upon, even in modern Quakerism. This is still very true, and this is very important for looking specifically at the Civil War and leading up to the Civil War. Varied opinions are meant to be considered valuable to learning as a religion is more personal in nature. So this is an interesting one for this particular project because throughout this we will be looking at a few differing opinions, especially those within the Quaker religion. And this is kind of where some of those hypocrisies will start popping up a little bit. So just some pre-Civil War context. Quakers' belief in the divine light within all God's people created great arguments and rifts between Society of Friends. In 1774, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting explicitly forbade ownership or selling of the enslaved and encouraged members to disown those of the Friends who did buy and sell them. As a community, it's widely unanimous that slavery and the purchase of slaves was forbidden in their practice. There was much emphasis on highlighting the hypocrisy of owning slaves and attempting to make money on the transatlantic slave trade. So, as previously mentioned, this is kind of where we start seeing that larger divide. It starts a little bit before 1774. There was always a little bit of a rift between Quaker ideologies, but before the Revolution, that's sort of where they start splitting, and you're starting to see more of that schism, as you do with many of the denominations during this period of time. So, although, as we previously saw, for example, varied opinions are meant to be considered valuable to learning, this is kind of more of that hypocrisy here. They're unanimous in saying that slavery is wrong because they are God's people. Everybody has that inner light, but they are attempting to tell other people that their opinion is wrong. So it is interesting and important to kind of put that out there in the context of things as well, despite what you may believe personally. And then from 1800 until the break out of the Civil War. Approximately 12,000 Southern Quakers who inhabited North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina followed the Great Quaker Migration to Indiana, Ohio, and New York due to fears of slave revolts and economic pressure. A lot of documents or written information is missing from this period, as is with much of the post-Civil War material, but they were not writing very much about this. They were instructed to not write too much or write letters to each other during this period, just out of safety. Daniel Krupa believes that putting context to these issues of the period and values of the Friends leads to an understanding that the fear of violence and economic hardship were the main reasons for this grand move. They were already facing economic hardship as they were being scrutinized in public society outside of the Friends, but their views on slavery and the slave trade really started setting them even more apart. So it was kind of them against the world at this point. Their views were starkly different. They didn't believe in violence. So there was already these opinions about the Revolutionary War and not getting involved or trying not to get involved. And then you're adding this in here as well, that they're migrating, they're not making money on their businesses, and their fear of the slave revolts and somehow being involved. So they're going to move. And that's important to note because these are the areas that a lot of your Quakers during the Civil War kind of wound up being drafted anyways. So, Quaker mindset of the war. As mentioned, war is forbidden, violence is forbidden. It's considered wicked when it goes against Quaker beliefs because of violence and life-taking actions. You don't want to take the life of somebody who holds a piece of God within them, so that's why violence is so against their religion. Friends were not even to be involved in simulations or military drills during school years, as any part of violence was not part of their doctrine. And here, there's a little bit of a letter that was written that the boys were meant to do a military drill at Boylston Hall, and they are looking for guidance to request that their son not be involved. There was no follow-up to this letter, I should say, so there's assumption from this piece by Peter Brock that they were excused. Otherwise, they would have received a counter letter giving reasons of why. So it's also important to note that although Quakers were pacifists, there was also the loophole some followed in the name of justice and upholding the inner light of God's people. So we'll see this with some of the soldiers specifically. Throughout Quaker history, this has and continues to be up for debate on how much Friends are able to become involved in wars and wartime efforts in the name of their community and God's creations. Thatcher writes, as a Quaker during World War I write from the standpoint of a pacifist, but not a non-resistant, which furthers the challenge of where do Quakers stand in a time of war. This is something that they face through all wars, although you'll see a greater mindset and community of being against it. You will see a good number of them still becoming involved because they feel called to do so. So here's the clash of conscience. It was a difficult period for Quakers because it challenged their values in different ways and affected their lives. So we had the internal conflict, questioning, do they follow the values taught by Quakerism and how they were raised and remain pacifists, or fight in the cause for social justice, or those other niche things they believe in Quakerism. Drafting. During the war, this was commonplace for men and difficult to abandon for Quakers. It was a lengthy process to get out of, and it involved a fine. You had to have an exemption letter, outside resources, and it was very difficult. And even through doing all this, there were still some, especially in the Confederate Army, that were imprisoned or tortured. Activism. It was difficult to not aid in war efforts, especially for women who were forced to become nurses or chose to become nurses. Could not help but assist the injured soldiers. So this is sort of a humanitarian effort. Of course, many people are going to see a lot of this going on, and they can't really help but feel close to fellow man, even if they're not Quaker. Religious community conflict. If Friends were to fight in the war or aid in war efforts, they were scrutinized by other members. This was more so for those who voluntarily enlisted, more than those who were drafted. And social community conflict. Those who did not volunteer or attempted to dodge the draft were considered unpatriotic and cowardly, causing strain socially and on businesses. We saw this previously when discussing the Great Migration for Quakers, because they moved from where they were to the north because of this problem. So there's a lot of conflicts that they're dealing with, more so than just north versus south during this period of time. So first, we have Daniel Wooten. He was a soldier for the Union Army. He volunteered to enlist to fight in the war, to uphold social justice and fight for his country against what he believed was evil. So during first 3 years of his service, he battled shame and regret. He had difficulty with himself, even though he felt that he was doing the right thing. He felt that he was disappointing his friends and his mother, and he actually lost contact with a lot of people back home because of his choice to enlist. So he exchanged letters during his service with a school friend, Miriam Green, nicknamed Mel, discussing his views on the matter, his beliefs that God wanted him to fight in this cause. And it was to Mel he often spoke of worry of what his mother thought, or how the members of Society of Friends viewed him for enlisting. He did eventually complete his service, believing he did the right thing by joining to defend his country, God, and those he cared about. But throughout his time in the Union Army, he was met with bouts of guilt, shame, and loneliness, as his friends would seldom write. So we have here this little bit he sent to Mel, thou shalt not kill. But what are we to do with those persons that rebel against the law of our country? Are we just to lay down and let them have the reins of this Republican government? No, never. So here is a little bit of when he's starting to come out of this shame. So this is a little bit just outside of those first 3 years, where he's starting to believe fully that this is what he needed to do, that he is doing the right thing. And then here is one of those letters, or pieces of those letters to Mel, where he's feeling that shame. Especially here, might have been standing of your soldier boy, had he have minded the workings of God in his heart, as his mother has oft times entreated him to do, and when it was not too late. The not too late portion is important. Daniel Wooten wrote a lot about this too late, or in those bouts of guilt or shame, that he was too late, that he had already given himself up. But we do see toward the end of the war, this is about a year before the end. I do remember that beautiful evening of which you have spoken, that I will assure you, Mel, there was more than one thought revolving in my mind upon that sublime evening. Duty to my country, to my God and my friends at home, and the object was which should I serve first. So I came to the conclusion, by serving my country, I would be serving my God and friends also. So in the end, he came to this conclusion that he did this for all the right reasons. He was defending the things that God had told them to defend, and fellow man, and he also felt that by him enlisting, he saved other men from enlisting, or protected his people. Next, we have the Ketchum brothers. So these were very well-educated brothers. They listed themselves as farmhands because they had the family farm in New York, but they were very well-educated. They could read and write very well. They wrote letters quite frequently to each other and friends back home. So they were grieved with the difficult decision to enlist or remain at home to help their elderly and newly widowed mother with the farm in New York. She had difficulty getting around, and she needed someone at home to help. Their Society of Friends were very much against war and violence, but both believed the war was from God. So this is another example that they believed that God was doing this for a purpose. They were being called, and this was one of those instances of internal conflict and choosing what part of their religion they valued the most. So they actually drew lots. They cast lots, and Edward drew and enlisted in 120th New York Infantry as a lieutenant. John was originally hesitant to join the war, but he felt guilty for Edward being the only one to enlist and be out there, and also started feeling this anxiety about not joining and not fighting the good fight alongside Edward. So the letters that Edward sent to John detailed a lot about the difficulty of war, being in the army, but that didn't keep him from joining. It actually set fire to him. So he joined alongside his cousin, and he also fought in the Union and became a lieutenant as well. Unfortunately, though, at Gettysburg, Edward had passed, and John was the one who went to gather his body. He was captured at Raccoon Ford and sent to Libby Prison. And Libby Prison was the worst that you could wind up in. He already was tired. He had just gotten out of the hospital himself, and he was in the hospital when he found out his brother had passed. So his already weakened condition did not help with being tortured for likely being a Quaker. This was super common in Confederate prisons, where if you were a certain Christian denomination that tried to have you dodge the draft, even if you did enlist, that you were tortured. John B. Crenshaw. So Crenshaw was a Quaker minister from Richmond who had connections and acquaintances from both the Union and Confederate governments. He built these on purpose because he foresaw that this Civil War was coming, basically. And being a minister, he saw many people, especially in Richmond. You're seeing a lot of different people even then. He was an aide during the Civil War for members who corresponded with soldiers who were drafted in the Confederate Army or put in Confederate prison for refusing to take up arms. So families often were the ones to write. They would hear word of their families being imprisoned or being drafted, and they would immediately write to him, hoping that he would know somebody to talk to. Some of his most famous letters to and from are John A. Campbell, Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederacy, who actually sympathized with the Quakers. Campbell was very sympathetic to the Christian religion. So it's said that if he ran into Christian soldiers who were not taking part in camp activities, so you're gambling, you're drinking, or anything of that nature, he actually was very respectful of that and tried to, even though he wasn't outwardly trying to protect them, he inwardly was trying to be protective of that. So Crenshaw was well known by friends and got many letters. He was frequently getting letters from everybody that could get their hands on him. Details within the letters show the heartbreaking reality of war for friends and their family members and truly depict the difficulties of self-preservation and societal challenges. So here's a few of these. We have this one here from a friend discussing two young men, one 18 years of age and was sent home and has never been in the service, escaped being forced into the army. He tried to reach the Free States, but he was arrested. So this was very common, where they would become arrested and wind up in prison. So here, a mourning mother sits beside me. Friends would write on behalf of family members or people that they knew who were in prison. And this actually did get resolved. I would like to add that he was able to write and have these two young men pardoned and released. They did have to pay a $500 fine each and find a substitute for them. And this one here, the passport they procured for me, which was quite a favor. So he was working consistently. He was talking to people. He was getting these materials. He was getting letters. He was passports, anything to help Quakers out of the draft or doing something else, not taking up arms and helping them get out of prison. This one here missed the opportunity of sending home and still in prison, having been 3 days and nights without one morsel of sustenance, either bread or water. And the captain visits twice a day, tells us that we will find Jen Ranson's orders carried out, for he will see us dead and buried before he will give way one particle. So this letter is very interesting. It's difficult to find these sort of letters, but for John B. Crenshaw, he actually had a large collection of these different letters actually depicting what was going on in these prisons. And it was difficult. It was difficult being a Quaker or a Christian in these prisons because they obviously did not take care of you. You would go unfed, you would go without water, and you would be tortured, such as John Ketchum. So here we have Lucretia Mott. She was an early feminist and human rights activist. She was very vocal about gender roles and the abolition of slavery. She was highly ostracized in society for speaking publicly, as women were not really allowed to be public speakers and openly protesting. But she did this alongside her husband. Her husband was very supportive and highlighted her very much and definitely loved the things that they believed in together. Though against slavery, however, she did not want to be involved in violence. She chose to protest and aid Quakers in education continuing faith. So she believed that by educating people, Quakers or not, she did educate soldiers as well. She believed that this was the way of ending violence. So although she did get a little bit involved with the soldiers, she wasn't getting involved in the taking up arms. So she had a quiet protest, is what it would be called. In her letters to her friend Graciana Lewis before the war, just before the war, she emphasized the importance of freeing slaves to herself and her meeting of friends, stating, "All of my meetings are anti-slavery meetings, and I trust that they will be while we hold millions of our fellow beings in abject bondage." The particular meeting of friends and society of friends she was in were very vocal about abolitionism. Next, we have Cornelia Hancock. So Cornelia is a very unique individual. She volunteered actually to participate as a war nurse, despite being told not to. She committed to aiding and nursing during the Civil War. Although she never joined any official medical groups such as the U.S. Sanitary Commission, she was very well respected by those around her and never without praise or supplies. They were always giving her supplies, and she was very good at what she did. Over time, she herself in a letter wrote that she had become benumbed due to everything that she had seen. She had even mentioned to a friend back home that she could see someone be beheaded in front of her and she probably would not react. She became more stoic as the war raged on, and she became more of a shell of herself in order to protect her own mind. So she lived a completely different life from what she grew up in. She rode horses. She, was actively aiding soldiers. And she was dressing differently. So she lived a completely different life than how she grew up. And after being questioned about her choices many times by her parents, her friends, she wrote home very agitatedly that they cannot expect everyone to be satisfied to live in as small a circle as themselves in these days of great events. So she began moving away from Quakerism because of the war and being outside of the community that she grew up in. So over the course of the Civil War, she continued to harden herself, moved away from these Quaker beliefs, and it all was because she felt more fulfilled being on the front lines and being an aide and being active in protest. So after the war, she actually followed a great number of these freed slaves and she lived a quiet life, but she continued being a nurse for these free slaves. So here we have Friends divided. Right here in Virginia, Quakers of Loudoun County, Virginia, they had split in the 1820s because of differing beliefs into Orthodox and Hicksite. So you're seeing that split, and they're actually naming this split. Eventually they do reunite with each other later on in the 1800s, but some of the differences were that some of the Friends were slave owners and involving themselves in the slave trade, and also they had different ideologies on voting and secession. So there were some who believed that seceding would help, and some did not believe that. But being in Virginia, that was very common for more than just the Quakers, of course. Up to 60% of the Loudoun County Friends owned and sold slaves. That is a large amount of Quakers. During the war, there continued to be discourse because members who enlisted or even drafted into the military were written out of some Quaker documents. So there were people who were just writing out these enlisted and drafted men. And the tension and differences were so great that after the war, membership was incredibly low for the Loudoun County Friends. So there was a lot of difficulty in Loudoun County, and in this meeting house in particular. There were arguments, and there's even a story about a particular meeting where a fight broke out. So you can imagine Quakers, who are pacifists, or supposed to be pacifists, breaking out into such a heated argument. And again, that is once again discussing that hypocrisy or the challenging of these beliefs, or looking deeper into what they really believe in. So here we have a meeting of friends. This is personally one of my favorite stories that I found. So Friends of Fairfax County and Loudoun County during the Civil War were constantly ridiculed for their anti-slavery beliefs and high rate of resistance of taking up arms. And it is important to note that this is 1861, so it was a little bit before the previous slide. 1861, early in the war, members of the Fairfax Society of Friends were eager to worship for the day. And in front of their meeting house, there were soldiers who were lodged there. So they had weaponry, their tents were up, and as they were approaching their meeting house, they were being made fun of because of their plain clothes, their beliefs, and just their strong beliefs against slavery and the war itself. So they compromised with the Army's commanding officer, and they invited them to come and see how Quakers pray. This was very different than what the soldiers were and commander were expecting. So they did. Many of the men of the Army did join them that day, and there was a lot of silence, as it usually does in the meeting house. And then an elderly woman, after this period of time, actually stood up and spoke, "God bless all here, and that the wings of peace might return to our prosperous country, and peace be with the strangers in our midst." And they were so moved by this statement and sentiment that soldiers openly wept. They were said to be sunburned greatly, and these grown men who were hardened by war and who were just making fun of them were openly weeping, not just little tears, fully weeping over this statement. So this is another way that some Quakers chose to use where they were and still speak the word of God. So in conclusion, for the Quakers, the Civil War brought upon them a great divide and conflicts that they had to face as individuals. Through this bloody war, they were essentially faced with the decision of what parts of their faith were most valuable to them as a person and what they were willing to hold within their conscience. The war brought many different feelings, choices, and changes to the faith that the Society of Friends could not have imagined would occur. So throughout these different stories, they made different choices and went against, a lot of the time, did go against their beliefs. Even if they did not go to war, if they did not take up arms, there were still ways that they could not help but help their fellow man or help the people that they cared about. And then here we have our bibliography. Thank you so much.